The sun was setting over the sprawling estate, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The wedding was in full swing, a luxurious affair filled with crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and impeccably dressed guests sipping champagne under the open-air pavilion. Sophie Bennett, 26, stood near the edge of the dance floor, her elegant gown catching the fading light. She tried to blend into the crowd, but the whispers and glances from certain guests reminded her that her past was still very much present. Her ex-fiancé, Richard Caldwell, a man whose arrogance matched his wealth, had arranged for this grand wedding months ago. Not hers, but for his new bride. Yet he had made sure Sophie was invited, under the guise of civility, fully intending to humiliate her in front of everyone. Sophie's heart tightened as he sauntered past, perfectly polished, smirking as if the entire room existed solely for his amusement. Sophie adjusted the delicate bracelet on her wrist, taking a deep breath. She remembered all the times Richard had belittled her, laughed at her choices, and dismissed her ambitions. Tonight, she would remain composed, graceful, and silent, but the tension inside her was palpable. Across the pavilion, Nathan Cole, the 32-year-old billionaire CEO, observed quietly. He had noticed Sophie years ago, long before she had stepped into this social nightmare, and admired her intelligence, kindness, and resilience. Nathan was known for his stoic demeanor, rarely showing emotion, but something about Sophie drew his attention like a magnet. Tonight, he had come not just as a guest but as someone who would ensure the evening did not spiral into a disaster at Sophie's expense. As the band played soft jazz, Richard approached Sophie, leaning close under the pretense of politeness. Well, look who decided to show up," he sneered. His tone was dripping with mockery, perfectly timed so that a few nearby guests could hear. "Still wearing those old gowns, Sophie? Some things never change, huh?" A hush rippled through the nearby tables. Sophie's cheeks flushed, a mix of embarrassment and anger. She lowered her gaze, her hands gripping the delicate folds of her dress. Every eye in the vicinity had now noticed the exchange, and whispers spread through the crowd. Nathan, seated a few tables away, felt his jaw tighten. He noticed the subtle shift in Sophie's posture, the slight slump, the way her fingers trembled around the fabric. He could see the humiliation she was enduring, and something inside him stirred. He had watched countless high-profile events, but seeing someone so clearly belittled despite her dignity struck a chord he could not ignore. Sophie tried to retreat, moving toward the refreshment table, pretending to check the champagne selection. But Richard followed, his smirk widening. "Don't bother hiding, Sophie," he said, loud enough that more guests turned to watch. "Everyone knows the truth about you. You never quite fit in, did you?" The sting of his words was sharp. Sophie's composure wavered. She had spent years rebuilding herself, stepping into social settings like this with poise, yet Richard's deliberate humiliation threatened to undo all that effort in a matter of moments. Nathan rose from his seat, his presence commanding yet calm. He moved through the crowd, every step measured, his tailored suit perfectly fitted, exuding authority. When he reached Sophie and Richard, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Guests noticed the new energy in the room, the CEO's quiet power, the controlled intensity of his gaze, the unmistakable aura that no one dared to challenge. He stopped a step away from Richard, his eyes locking on the ex-fiancé with a calm yet piercing intensity. "That's enough," Nathan said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the hushed crowd. "Leave her alone." Richard, momentarily taken aback, tried to laugh it off. "And you are?" he asked, attempting to assert dominance. Nathan's gaze did not waver. "She's with me," he said, his tone precise, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The words struck through the room like a thunderclap. Every guest turned to see, some shocked, some impressed. Sophie's eyes widened, a mix of surprise, relief, and awe flooding through her. The man she had admired quietly from afar had just stepped forward, publicly defending her honor in a room full of judgmental eyes. Richard's smugness faltered. The confidence he had relied upon, the control over the social scene, now crumbled in the presence of someone whose authority no one questioned. Whispers and murmurs echoed through the crowd, as people realized that the power dynamics had shifted dramatically in Sophie's favor. Nathan gestured subtly, indicating that Sophie should step aside, and she moved closer to him. The subtle contact, just a touch on the elbow, communicated reassurance without fanfare. Nathan's protective presence was enough. Sophie straightened, her posture now reflecting confidence rather than embarrassment. Guests began to return their attention to the proceedings of the wedding, but the moment lingered in the air. A public vindication, a quiet show of power and respect, and the undeniable beginning of a connection between Sophie and Nathan. The band resumed softly, but for Sophie, the room no longer felt hostile. Nathan leaned slightly toward her, just enough that only she could hear. "You don't have to face people like that alone," he murmured, his voice steady yet warm. Sophie felt a subtle thrill, her heart racing, not from fear, but from the sense that she was finally seen, respected and supported. The ex-fiancé Richard slunk back toward his guests, humiliated yet unwilling to admit it outright. Vivian's plan to embarrass Sophie publicly had failed, foiled by the quiet, decisive intervention of the CEO. Sophie, still standing beside Nathan, felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safety, trust, and a tentative excitement for what might come next. The wedding continued, but for her, the evening had transformed. One simple act of courage had shifted the narrative entirely. And in that moment, surrounded by glittering lights and curious eyes, Sophie realized that the future held possibilities she had never dared imagine. Protection, respect, and perhaps the slow unfolding of love. The glittering lights of the wedding hall reflected softly off the crystal chandeliers, casting a warm glow over the polished marble floors. Guests laughed and mingled, glasses clinked, and the scent of fresh roses mingled with the delicate perfume of the attendees. Sophie Bennett, 26, still felt the echo of her ex-fiancé's mockery lingering in her mind. Richard Caldwell had orchestrated the entire moment to humiliate her, whispering remarks about her past, subtle digs about her career, and calculated smirks that drew the attention of nearby guests. But she held her head high, letting the sting of embarrassment fuel her resolve rather than destroy her confidence. Nathan Cole, the 32-year-old billionaire CEO, had moved to stand beside her, his presence calm but commanding. He radiated a quiet authority that seemed to make the air itself shift. Sophie felt a subtle sense of protection as he positioned himself between her and the watching crowd, ensuring that no further humiliation could reach her. She had admired him from afar, intrigued by his intellect and composure, but now she realized he was far more than the aloof executive she had imagined. Richard, realizing that his attempt to assert dominance had been undermined, leaned closer to Sophie, speaking in a tone meant to be both intimate and cutting. "You really think standing next to him changes anything? This is a crowd, Sophie. People will always remember who you were." Sophie met his gaze steadily. "People can judge all they want," she replied softly, "but I'm not the same person you knew. And tonight, I don't need your approval." Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly, and he gave a subtle nod, a gesture that communicated both agreement and a warning. "She's with me," he repeated quietly, loud enough for Richard to hear, reinforcing the public declaration of respect and support. The crowd around them shifted, some glancing curiously, others nodding subtly in acknowledgement of the clear change in power dynamics. Despite the public support from Nathan, Sophie's nerves were on edge. The wedding was far from over, and Richard had not yet retreated. He moved through the guests, attempting to reclaim control, and subtly whispered comments to their mutual acquaintances about Sophie's past struggles. Her failed career, family troubles, and the perceived instability that had followed her since her breakup with him. Sophie felt the weight of the words, but she reminded herself of the strength that had carried her through years of challenge. She could not allow him to dictate her self-worth tonight, not when Nathan had already validated her presence and dignity. Nathan, observing Richard's maneuvering, remained poised. He quietly instructed his assistants to subtly monitor the room, ensuring that any further attempts at humiliation could be intercepted. He had witnessed Sophie's resilience and intelligence before, and tonight, he was committed to protecting her not just physically in the social sense, but emotionally from the cruel manipulations of her ex. As the wedding speeches began, Richard made his way to the podium to address the guests, attempting to reclaim the narrative. He spoke eloquently about loyalty, love, and ambition, subtly weaving in barbs aimed at Sophie. Yet every word he uttered seemed to falter against the quiet confidence emanating from Nathan and Sophie standing together. Nathan's gaze, calm and unwavering, held a silent warning. Any further attempt to demean Sophie would not go unnoticed. After the speech, the guests mingled again, and Sophie was approached by several of them, offering polite congratulations and subtle words of encouragement. She noticed the change in demeanor. Those who had once whispered judgment now spoke with respect. Nathan's quiet intervention had shifted the social balance entirely. Nathan leaned slightly toward Sophie as they moved through the crowd. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice low, ensuring only she could hear. Sophie nodded, grateful for his presence. I think so," she replied. "It's just difficult sometimes to be seen for who I really am, not what people assume." Nathan's expression softened. "I see you," he said simply. "And I intend to make sure no one undermines that tonight." The night progressed, with Nathan subtly guiding Sophie through the remaining social interactions, introducing her to influential guests, and creating moments where her intelligence and poise could be recognized. Guests who had come expecting drama were instead met with quiet dignity and confidence. Meanwhile, Richard, frustrated and realizing that his public mockery had failed, began to retreat, though not without a final attempt to regain superiority. He whispered one last attempt at ridicule, only to be met by Nathan's cool, piercing gaze and a polite but firm public dismissal, leaving him momentarily speechless. Sophie felt a subtle warmth in her chest, not just from the protection Nathan offered, but from the realization that her strength, composure, and resilience were being noticed and valued. The humiliation she had feared was now replaced with recognition, respect, and the faint stirrings of curiosity and admiration from the man who had always seemed untouchable. As the evening drew to a close, Nathan escorted Sophie to a quieter corner of the venue, away from the prying eyes of gossiping guests. "You handled yourself remarkably tonight," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "I've admired your strength from afar, but tonight I saw it fully." Sophie felt a flush of emotion. I'm just trying to stay true to myself," she said softly. Nathan's gaze lingered on her, thoughtful and intense. "And that is exactly why I respect you. There's more to tonight than social appearances. There's integrity, intelligence, and courage. All qualities you carry, and all qualities I value." For a brief moment, the world outside faded. The music, the clinking glasses, the chatter of the remaining guests, all irrelevant. In that quiet corner, amid the remnants of wedding festivities, the foundation of trust, respect, and the first hints of something deeper began to form between Nathan and Sophie. The night had been a battlefield of ego, past grievances, and public scrutiny, but thanks to Nathan's timely intervention, Sophie had been protected, her dignity restored, and the first seeds of a slow-burning connection planted. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark sky, reflecting in the wet pavement like the promise of a future still to unfold. A future where Sophie's strength and Nathan's integrity could intertwine, shaping not only the evening's events but the course of their lives together. The wedding hall glimmered under the warm glow of chandeliers, their reflections dancing on the polished floors. Guests milled about, glasses in hand, murmuring in hushed tones, but the tension in the room had reached a palpable peak. Sophie Bennett, 26, had regained a portion of her confidence after Nathan Cole's protective declaration earlier in the evening, yet the shadow of her ex-fiancé, Richard Caldwell, lingered like a storm cloud. Richard's plan had not entirely unraveled. He had hoped his subtle manipulations and whispered jabs could reclaim the attention of the crowd, continuing to undermine Sophie's presence. He moved with calculated poise, stopping near clusters of guests, making comments about Sophie's past, her failed career, and her perceived inadequacies. Each remark was measured, designed to sting, but Nathan's presence nearby curtailed the most egregious attempts. Nathan, 32, watched the interplay carefully. His eyes sharp, his posture commanding but calm. Every subtle movement of Richard's hand, every shift of expression was noted. Nathan had understood early on that words could wound more than any physical gesture. And while he had already intervened once, the stakes of the evening demanded vigilance. He could not allow Sophie's dignity to be challenged further. Sophie moved with poise, though her pulse quickened. She knew every eye in the room was subtly observing the tension between her, Richard, and Nathan. Despite her anxiety, she held herself with grace, a quiet defiance emanating from her. She refused to allow humiliation to dominate the narrative of her evening. Richard approached the podium, intending to deliver a toast. The crowd's chatter hushed as he began to speak. His words smooth and practiced. "To old friends and new beginnings," he said. His tone polished, masking the subtle undertone aimed at Sophie. "Life often brings surprises. Sometimes people change, sometimes they don't." His eyes flicked toward Sophie, glinting with the intent to unsettle her. A ripple of unease spread through the audience. Sophie's breath caught, and she felt a flash of panic. Yet she caught Nathan's gaze. He raised his eyebrow ever so slightly, a silent signal of support. That small gesture gave her strength. She stood taller, shoulders back, and met Richard's gaze with quiet confidence. Nathan stepped forward, his presence suddenly commanding the attention of the room. "Richard," he said firmly, voice carrying effortlessly across the hall. "I believe it's important that everyone here understands the truth about integrity, respect, and the way people should be treated. Sophie deserves better than ridicule." Richard faltered for a moment, realizing his control over the room was slipping. The audience murmured, some glancing nervously at him, others impressed by Nathan's decisive intervention. Nathan's calm authority contrasted sharply with Richard's flustered demeanor. Nathan gestured subtly toward Sophie. "She has conducted herself with dignity tonight, despite attempts to undermine her. This is not just about appearances, it's about character, courage, and grace." A few guests whispered in agreement. The shift in energy was palpable. The social balance had changed. Richard's carefully constructed image of superiority had been shattered in an instant, replaced by admiration for Sophie and respect for Nathan. Sophie's chest rose and fell steadily, her heart pounding in her ears. She had survived the public mockery, regained her composure, and now felt a deep sense of validation. Nathan's protection was not ostentatious but firm, signaling to everyone that she was not alone and that her worth extended beyond the judgments of others. Richard, sensing that he was losing influence, tried one last maneuver, raising his voice, emphasizing past grievances, attempting to sway the remaining attendees. Yet Nathan's calm but authoritative presence countered every word. He leaned slightly closer to Sophie and murmured just for her to hear, "Stand tall. You've handled this with more courage than he ever could." Sophie's eyes met Nathan's, and a quiet understanding passed between them. The subtle warmth of trust and admiration began to weave between them, a thread of connection that was unspoken but undeniable. As the evening progressed, Nathan escorted Sophie through the remaining social interactions, subtly guiding conversations to highlight her talents, intelligence, and poise. Guests who had previously judged her now observed her with respect. Every word Nathan spoke amplified her credibility. Every gesture reinforced her dignity. Richard, now isolated and visibly flustered, realized the tide had turned. His ex-fiancée's arrogance and manipulations had been nullified by the unlikely alliance between Sophie and Nathan. The crowd's attention shifted naturally, acknowledging the genuine strength and composure that Sophie exuded. Eventually, the speeches concluded, and the couple at the center of the wedding celebration returned to the stage. Sophie, standing beside Nathan, felt a rare serenity. The earlier humiliation had transformed into triumph, her dignity restored publicly. Nathan's presence had made the difference. His intervention a quiet but powerful assertion of protection, respect, and authority. In a private moment, Nathan leaned closer to Sophie as the crowd danced and celebrated. "Tonight, you handled yourself with remarkable courage," he said softly. "I admire that." Sophie smiled faintly, warmth spreading through her chest. I didn't know what else to do," she admitted. Nathan's gaze softened, a subtle acknowledgement of the beginning of trust and connection. "Sometimes the right person appears at the right moment," he said quietly. "And tonight, you proved that integrity and courage speak louder than mockery or power." The evening drew to a close, the glittering lights fading into the calm of the night outside. Sophie felt a sense of closure from the humiliation, a budding respect for Nathan, and a faint anticipation for the unfolding possibilities. The wedding had been more than a celebration. It had been a proving ground of character, courage, and subtle connection. As the guests departed and the last echoes of laughter faded, Sophie and Nathan shared a quiet look, an unspoken acknowledgement that this was only the beginning. The ex-fiancé had been publicly undermined. Sophie had regained her dignity, and the first true spark of trust and admiration had ignited between her and the billionaire CEO who had stepped in when she needed it most. The wedding hall had quieted down, the music fading as the last of the guests took their leave. Sophie Bennett stood near the balcony, overlooking the twinkling lights of the city below. Her heart still raced from the earlier confrontation, Richard's mockery, the public humiliation, and Nathan Cole's decisive intervention. She had regained her dignity, but the adrenaline and the awareness of what had almost happened lingered. Nathan approached, his presence calm and steady, exuding a quiet authority that immediately put her at ease. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, private, yet full of concern. Sophie smiled faintly, a mix of relief and lingering tension. "I think so." "Thanks to you," she replied, her gaze meeting his. Nathan nodded, his eyes reflecting a depth of admiration. "You handled yourself remarkably tonight. Most would have crumbled under that scrutiny, but you didn't. You stood tall." Sophie felt warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just relief, it was validation, recognition from someone she respected. Nathan's words carried weight, a subtle acknowledgement of her courage, intelligence, and composure. Meanwhile, Richard Caldwell lingered near the exit, his ego bruised and his plan completely thwarted. Guests who had witnessed his attempts at humiliation whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others smirking at the irony. He had intended to control the narrative, but it had backfired spectacularly. Publicly, he was humiliated. Privately, he realized he had lost not only the battle for perception but also any influence over Sophie. Nathan guided Sophie to a quieter corner of the venue, away from the remaining staff and lingering guests. "I wanted to ensure you were all right," he said, gesturing subtly. "You didn't deserve what happened, and I won't allow anyone to treat you that way again." Sophie's lips curved into a small, grateful smile. I appreciate that. "More than I can say," she whispered. Nathan glanced out at the city skyline, then back at her. "There's something else," he said carefully. "I want you to know that your strength, intelligence, and integrity haven't gone unnoticed. You've proven that appearances can be deceiving. True value isn't always recognized at first glance." Sophie felt a surge of pride, a reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. All her past struggles, moments of doubt, and private insecurities seemed to settle, replaced by clarity and acknowledgement. Nathan's recognition was not just public, it was personal, sincere, and powerful. As they stood together, the city lights casting a soft glow over the balcony, Nathan reached out subtly, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. It was a gentle, protective gesture, understated yet intimate. Sophie felt her pulse quicken, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger with each passing second. Richard, seeing the interaction from a distance, realized fully that his influence had ended. His attempts to embarrass Sophie had only highlighted her resilience and Nathan's admiration for her. The humiliation he had planned for her now served as a lesson. Power and arrogance could be challenged by courage and integrity, even from someone society underestimated. Nathan and Sophie spent the remainder of the evening quietly discussing lighter matters, moving through the remnants of the wedding with ease. He introduced her to a few remaining guests, highlighting her intelligence subtly, without drawing attention to the drama of earlier events. Sophie navigated the interactions with growing confidence, realizing that she had not only survived the ordeal but emerged stronger and more respected. By the time the last guests had departed, the two found themselves alone on the balcony, the cityscape sprawling below. Nathan spoke again, softer this time. "Tonight wasn't just about defending you. It was about showing that integrity and courage matter. I've seen many people falter under pressure. But you've proven your worth." Sophie looked at him, her chest filled with a quiet mix of pride, gratitude, and something more, a curiosity about what this connection could become. I'm glad you were here," she admitted. Nathan smiled faintly, the hint of warmth in his eyes unmistakable. "And I'll continue to be," he said simply. The words carried weight, promise, and a subtle invitation for trust. The night ended with a sense of closure and possibility. Sophie's dignity was restored, her courage recognized, and Nathan's admiration had opened a door, not just to safety and respect, but to the slow and delicate unfolding of a relationship built on trust, integrity, and mutual understanding. Richard's lesson was complete. The ex-fiancé's attempts to control the narrative had failed, replaced by admiration for the woman he once underestimated and respect for the man who had stood beside her. Outside, the city sparkled, oblivious to the quiet victories and connections that had taken place within the walls of the grand estate. And as Sophie looked at Nathan, she realized that the evening had not only saved her from humiliation but had also revealed the start of something profoundly new, a connection that could grow into trust, respect, and maybe, just maybe, love. The wedding hall had emptied, leaving only the soft hum of the city outside and the faint sparkle of chandeliers reflecting on the polished floors. Sophie Bennett, 26, stood with a calm but proud composure, her elegant gown catching the last traces of light. The tension of the evening, the whispers, the smirks, and the humiliating jabs from her ex-fiancé Richard, had finally dissolved. Nathan Cole, the 32-year-old billionaire CEO, remained close, his presence a reassuring anchor. Richard Caldwell, visibly humbled and defeated, had been forced to acknowledge the failure of his manipulations. The guests who had once watched Sophie with curiosity and judgment now regarded her with respect. Richard's arrogance had been stripped away by the very woman he sought to undermine, and by the man who had defended her with authority and dignity. Nathan stepped closer to Sophie, his voice quiet but firm. "Tonight, you handled yourself with grace and courage. You faced mockery and judgment without compromise. That takes strength few possess." Sophie smiled softly, feeling a warmth in her chest. "I just tried to stay true to myself," she replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. Nathan's gaze lingered, a subtle smile forming. "And that's exactly why I respect you. Tonight was about more than appearances. It was about integrity, resilience, and character. And you've shown all of that." Sophie felt a mix of relief and pride. The humiliation that had once seemed unbearable was now replaced with acknowledgement, not only from Nathan but from the crowd that had witnessed her quiet strength. The respect she had earned was authentic and deserved. Richard, realizing his efforts had backfired, quietly excused himself, leaving with a final glance of regret and awareness of his own misjudgment. The ex-fiancé who had intended to control and humiliate Sophie now departed humbled, his plans for dominance nullified. Nathan extended his hand subtly toward Sophie. "You've proven something important tonight, not just to them but to yourself. And I'd like to continue seeing that strength grow." Sophie took a gentle breath, her eyes meeting his. I'd like that too," she admitted softly, a quiet spark of anticipation igniting within her. The two walked together to the balcony overlooking the city, the lights below shimmering like stars scattered across the streets. Nathan's presence was steady, reassuring, and protective, yet unassuming. Sophie felt safe, respected, and seen. Not for her past, not for appearances, but for the courage and intelligence she carried within her. As they stood side by side, Nathan spoke again, his voice low and intimate. Tonight was proof that dignity and strength can shine even in the harshest circumstances. And sometimes, the right person shows up to notice it. Sophie's lips curved into a genuine smile, a mixture of relief, pride, and the first stirrings of trust. "Thank you, Nathan. For everything." Nathan's hand brushed hers lightly, a subtle, respectful touch, carrying the weight of admiration and the promise of something more. The connection between them was slow, measured, and authentic, rooted in mutual respect, trust, and the shared experience of navigating public scrutiny and personal integrity. In the following weeks, Sophie began working closely with Nathan, her talent and intelligence recognized fully. Their professional relationship gradually deepened into something more intimate. Trust blossomed into quiet companionship, shared laughter, and moments of subtle emotional intimacy. Richard's role faded into the background, his arrogance replaced by a lesson in humility. Vivian's shadow, once looming, no longer threatened Sophie's path. The evening's events had shifted the balance. Sophie had regained her dignity, Nathan had demonstrated integrity and decisiveness, and a slow-burning, authentic connection had begun to form between them. The story concluded with a satisfying sense of closure. Sophie's public humiliation had been reversed, the ex-fiancé's schemes exposed, and the billionaire CEO's intervention had not only restored justice but also forged the beginnings of trust and romance. As the city lights sparkled below, Sophie and Nathan stood together, ready to navigate a future built on courage, respect, and the quiet promise of love.